the Stars organization announced two inaugural members of the Dallas Stars Hall of Fame. We'll talk about Derian Hatcher and Bob Gainey on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
You're Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Dallas Stars media, coming to you on this Wednesday, July 20th. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener, thank you for stopping by today's episode of Locked On Stars and for making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to our show on YouTube as well as on your favorite podcasting platform. Remember, we are free and available no matter where or how you listen. Be sure to find and follow me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis. You can also find our show as well, just simply Locked On Stars. But without any further hesitation, let's jump into today's episode. Things really calm on the free agency trade front, especially with the Stars still waiting to see where John Klingberg lands, but also more importantly for the organization, waiting for the official announcement of Jason Robertson and Jake Ottinger's extensions. But while we wait for those things to happen, wanted to highlight some news that has come out the past few days about the Stars organization as a whole, both in the present and celebrating the past. It was announced a few days ago that the Stars would be, or it was really announced back in February that the Stars would be opening a Dallas Stars Hall of Fame. And just a handful of days ago, they announced the, inaugural first two inductees of that Hall of Fame in player Derian Hatcher, and then in the builder category, Bob Gainey. And I wanted to talk about both men on today's episode because both of them play key factors and pretty important roles in the history of the Stars franchise, mainly as it pertains to their time in Dallas. Of course, starting with Derian Hatcher, known by many as the captain that helped lead the Dallas Stars to their first and only Stanley Cup title so far in the history of the franchise. Hatcher was drafted 8th overall in 1990, back when the Stars were in Minnesota and they were the Minnesota North Stars. And he's a huge reason why the sport of hockey did so well in Dallas and why the Dallas Stars were pretty easy for fans to, jump on the bandwagon for whenever the team relocated, not just relocated, but moved from the North, where hockey is a very popular sport, to the South, where it was still kind of a foreign idea, except for people that had maybe been following the early days of the NHL from afar. But he was such a huge contributor to those Dallas Stars teams when he was the captain in the 90s, especially helping them get to the Stanley Cup in 1999 when they won it, and even getting back to the Cup final in the year 2000. And of course, he was just one of many pieces of what was an excellent leadership core. I mean, even just looking, I believe it was Elite Prospects website had the list of the captains and alternate captains for the Stanley Cup champion team for the Stars, with Hatcher as the captain, Zubov, Modano, and Neuendijk as the alternate captains. I mean, what a leadership combination right there to help get your team to the pinnacle of the sport. But Hatcher, not just the captain. He's a guy that is a storied member of this organization, 7th in games played in franchise history at 827, 4th in all-time points for a defenseman. I'm just a guy that fans really did enjoy because he was everything you would want your captain to be. And he's a guy that kind of set the standard for being the captain of the Dallas Stars and kind of was the embodiment of what Dallas Stars hockey has been about really since its inaugural days back in 1993 when it all got started, and even to as it is now. I think a lot of the things that even a guy like Jamie Benn has done as captain of the Stars, there are things that were done similarly by Hatcher whenever he had the C on his sweater. I mean, he was never the loudest in the room. He was never this crazy outspoken guy that always, had to demand the center of attention or always have something insightful to say. He was a pretty soft-spoken guy, a guy who would stand up for his teammates. And just the word I see most used about him, doing a little bit of research before today's episode, was just the warrior mentality that Hatcher brought night in and night out. A guy that was just ready to go to battle with the guys on his team, and he would fight for the guys that were on his side. And, many probably remember one of his most, I guess, infamous or famous, however you want to determine it, run-ins with Jeremy Roenick, breaking his jaw after, I believe, Roenick had placed a pretty big hit on Mike Modano a few games earlier. This was pretty early on into my life. I think I was 4 or 5 years old when this went down. Was not watching Dallas Stars hockey at the time, so might not have all my facts there, but I did see the video of Hatcher knocking down Jeremy Roenick up against the boards, breaking his jaw. I mean, just an absolutely brutal hit. And of course, the NHL, a very different sport back then as far as, the hits that were laid and the level of physicality in the NHL back then. But still, I mean, you see a guy like Jamie Benn and even, other captains across the league do this as well, but especially for the Stars organization. Hatcher just did so much in paving the way of what it meant to be a leader on the Dallas Stars team, of not running or backing down to anyone, but taking the fight to them, both in terms of physicality. And he was still a pretty talented hockey player. I think he often gets overshadowed by some of the other talent on that team, whether it was Modano, Zubov. I mean, so many other talented forwards and defensemen on that team. He was still a pretty decent player who could score really well. And of course, you don't always see defensemen being the captains of teams these days. You see it every now and then, but definitely isn't as common as seeing a forward. But it does beg the question, I think, having a guy like Hatcher here in this franchise's history, about to be inducted into the franchise's Hall of Fame. Could we see a defenseman don the C on their Stars sweater sometime in the future? Namely, Miro Heiskanen comes to mind, because Jamie Benn is not going to be around forever, despite how big his contract is, and he still will be here for a while. And I think as long as he is in Dallas, he will be the captain of the team. But once he moves on, whether it's by going to a different team or retiring, could we potentially see a guy like Miro Heiskanen wear the C on his jersey? They're very different players, Miro and Hatcher, but that's a different talking point for a different day, probably years from now, talking about who the future captain of the team would be. But it certainly is an interesting idea to ponder and think about. And, you even look at this past year with Sergei Zubov rightfully getting his number retired in the rafters at the American Airlines Center, retired by the organization. Kind of raises this question of who would get their jersey retired next. And I think if you start that conversation, you certainly cannot have that discussion without talking about Hatcher's number 2. I think he would certainly, rightfully so, be up for consideration if the team was looking to retire another number sometime in the near future. Not guaranteeing it'll happen, not entirely sure if it will, but if you're going to have that discussion about Dallas Stars, former Dallas Stars who deserve to have their numbers retired, I think you definitely do need to bring up Hatcher's number 2 for consideration. Well, coming up next, we will talk about the second inductee of the Dallas Stars inaugural Hall of Fame class. We will talk about Bob Gainey after a quick break. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. You can find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering information, including live betting, esports, and scores. And BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. BetOnline.net is the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite sports and events, including MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to their website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action. BetOnline.net, where the game starts. Moving on to the next segment of today's episode. Thank you for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. We've talked about Derian Hatcher getting inducted into the Dallas Stars Hall of Fame, and now we're shifting our focus to the builder category, and of course, Bob Gainey. Gainey is like Hatcher, a huge part of the reason why the sport of hockey and the Dallas Stars in general were so successful when they initially moved to Texas in 1993. Gainey served as the in the hockey operations department from 1990 to 2002. And whenever he was in that position, the Stars made the playoffs in 1994, 95, 97, 98, 99, 2000, and 2001. In that stretch, they had 2 Stanley Cup Finals appearances where they won in 1999 and, of course, in the year 2000. And they also won the President's Trophy twice in the 97-98 season, as well as the 98-99 season. So a ton of success pretty early on within the Stars' early days in Texas, making the playoffs pretty consistently, even as early as 1994. Pretty incredible to think about whenever you're not just relocating a team to a nearby place or a city or location where they're used to having hockey, or maybe there's been that sport in the past. But this was a new city for the NHL and kind of a new geographic location, moving all the way from Minnesota, which borders Canada, which is around a lot of the original 6-team areas where the NHL started out and was kind of developed as a league, and moving all the way to one of the most southern parts of the United States. It's pretty incredible to think about. And he just had a ton of responsibility. He was at one point the coach and the general manager of the Stars until 1995, when he moved on from coaching, hired a new coach, and then focused solely on being the general manager, where he went on to build some of the best rosters in franchise history by adding players like Joe Nieuwendyk, Sergei Zubov, Brett Hull, Ed Belfour. And even in the draft, he got some of the most iconic Dallas Stars in team history, like Marty Turco, Steve Ott, Brendan Morrow, Yuri Lettinen. I mean, the list can go on and on and on. I mean, the Stars had about as good of a start as you could have once you move from one city to another across the country. And a big part of that was the work that a guy like Gainey was able to put in by bringing in so many excellent players, building a good coaching staff, and then that in turn helps gets the fans engaged and committed to following this team. And he's one of the key reasons that really, a Southern team like Dallas, really the first quote unquote Southern team, won the Stanley Cup. I mean, hockey, like I said, started up north. You, of course, have the original 6 teams in Canada, in the United States, in the more northern parts of the country. The league did begin to expand, but it still, even when it started to expand and grow, it went to cities like Philadelphia, went to cities like Pittsburgh, and so on and so forth, and then eventually it kind of started making its way down south. And, Colorado may have won the cup in 1996. And even though that's more quote unquote Southern than a place like Montreal or Toronto or Boston or New York, Chicago, it's still, kind of in a colder, geographic area that's similar to those locations. But really, you have to say that the Dallas Stars were the first true Southern team, or team located in the southern region of the country or continent, to win the Stanley Cup. And I think that was massive and probably really odd and really unprecedented at the time. I mean, I was 6 months old when the Stars won that Stanley Cup, so I wasn't really, conscious enough to experience what the reaction was when that happened from the rest of the hockey world. But you even look at today's NHL, and so many of the best teams in the league are not up in the north. You do have some good teams that are still up north, like Toronto and Boston, teams like that. But you look at the south with teams like Tampa Bay, who's been so dominant over the past several seasons, a team like Florida, who's really come around over the past few years, teams like Carolina, who have become really good. Nashville has had their moments in the sun in recent memory. I mean, it's, not all due to the credit of just the Dallas Stars or Bob Gainey, but it certainly was kind of that first step and truly saying, okay, we think hockey can work down here, because not only will people get behind a team and support a team down here, but these teams can win, and these teams can win effectively and make it all the way to the Cup Finals and eventually win. And we've continued to see that time in, time out, years and years and years down the road. I mean, there's still clearly really good teams that are competitive up in North, competitive from Canada, but you can't just say it's a sport that primarily belongs to that region of the country or the continent of North America. And it's just really crazy to see how the sport has grown and even continued to flourish in popularity here in Dallas and the rest of the southern region of the United States, beyond just kind of the northeast part of America, as well as Canada. And, this team with the Stars has just remained a staple here in the Metroplex ever since it came here in 1993 and has one of the most committed fan bases. I mean, there's people that have been fans since they moved to Texas in 93, and they have stuck with the team through thick and thin and watched everything play out since their, early days here in the Lone Star State. And it's really cool to see, and really one of the more unique stories in the world of sports, especially in the overall lore of NHL history, which is massive and always seemingly expanding with new information coming out at times. But Bob Gainey certainly deserving to be inducted in the Dallas Stars Hall of Fame because of the work that was put in, the early on groundwork that was put in to build a competitive team early on, to get the fans engaged. And now, back then they established fans that are still fans to this day, people that are season ticket holders, people that are at every single home game or hosting watch parties whenever the team's on the road. Really, really cool to see the foundation that was laid by Bob Gainey and so many others to see where this team has come now. Well, coming up next, we will continue to talk about the Stars Hall of Fame and why it's so important and I think crucial if the Stars organization wants to continue to grow its fan base. More on that after a quick break. All right, we're closing out today's episode of Locked On Stars, talking about the importance of the Dallas Stars Hall of Fame. As I said earlier in the episode, and I'm sure as many of you know, the Stars did announce back in February of this year that they would be introducing this new Dallas Stars Hall of Fame in order to honor the legacy of so many who have paved the way and made this franchise what it is in this modern era in 2022. Because as great as some of the recent years have been for this organization, there were tons of great years back in the mid 90s and even some stretches in the 2000s and 2010s as well that are worth covering. And I think this is a really cool endeavor that the Stars are taking on in order to help educate the fan base about the history of the organization. Because as we've touched on, thousands upon thousands of people fell in love with this team and the players back in the early to mid 90s as they competed for the Cup back in the late 90s in 1999 and 2000. And, a great team, some of the greatest players in the NHL at the time, like Modano and Zubov and Lettinen. Some of the greatest stars in the entire league were playing here in Texas in the early days of the organization. And so many people just bought in and were committed to supporting this new team that was taking over the state of Texas. And the team did take somewhat of a dip in the mid 2000s to early 2010s. Not as many playoff appearances, not as many successful seasons, but a lot of the older fans or the fans that had been there since the beginning stayed loyal. But there wasn't really a sweeping movement of people following the team or really a ton of, an influx of new fans jumping on the bandwagon, if you will, because there wasn't really much of a bandwagon to jump on. But then things started really trending upward. I guess you could say maybe with the emergence of Tyler Seguin and Jamie Benn. Whenever Seguin came over from Boston, Ben kind of, steps into the organization and becomes the captain. Things really started to take a turn kind of in the mid 2010s. And of course, to the end of the decade and even into the early 2020s, this team really kind of started to hit new levels and hit a new stride. Of course, we all know back in the fall of 2020, they shocked the world and went to the Stanley Cup finals, where they did eventually lose to the Lightning. But still, that was such a huge moment for this organization and something that I think was more meaningful than just the sport of hockey, because as I'm sure, we all know that the world was in a really weird place and a lot of people were struggling and there was just not a lot of hope in that moment. But that team, the Dallas Stars of the 2019-2020 season, gave the people of Dallas something to look forward to and something to, support and put hope in for a little bit while they were going on that incredible run. And even I think just that moment brought in this new wave of fans, this new generation of hockey fans and Dallas Stars fans. I remember even being still in college whenever that Cup run was happening, and a small watch party in one of the bigger areas on campus to watch. I believe it was either game 3 or 4 of the Stanley Cup finals. But, people that didn't really know about the sport of hockey, weren't super familiar with it or familiar with the Stars, but starting to get invested in the sport and starting to support this team just because of the immaculate run that they were going on. And so now, even with that, you look at this past year with a pretty successful season, all things considered, with some of the better young talent in the game like Robertson and Ottinger, there seems to be this resurgence of interest in the Stars with their bright young talent. And, you can credit that to the team, and you can also credit that to some of the national attention that the league as a whole is getting, with TNT and ESPN picking up a lot more games, and a lot of the more games being more accessible to the public and nationally televised. And the Dallas Stars Hall of Fame coming in, I think, is a fantastic opportunity to welcome in this new wave of Dallas Stars fans to help, support this growth of movement for Stars support, and say, okay, welcome to the Dallas Stars family. We're glad you're cheering on this organization. Now here's kind of a look at history to see where we've been and where we've come from, because, that's a great thing for even people like me, a guy who came onto the sport of hockey a little bit later, not really until I was in my late teen years. And so, something like this would be super beneficial for me, as well as other younger and or new fans who want to learn more about the team's history, and get to know some of the best players that have ever played in the league, as well as the organization. So it's a really, really cool opportunity that will be kind of added on to the American Airlines Center experience. If you're going to catch a game, you can kind of take a look at the Dallas Stars Hall of Fame, which will continue to expand over the years with more players and more members of the front office who helped shape this organization and this team to what it is today. And it's a really, really cool opportunity situation. Let me know in the comments down below some people that you think are a shoo-in for the Dallas Stars Hall of Fame and or potential jersey number retirements. As we talked about Derian Hatcher on this episode, I'm sure there might be some other people that the Stars fans out there, I'm sure there are guys that you want to see have their numbers retired here sometime soon. That's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you again for tuning in, for making us your first listen of the day. Please do hit that subscribe button down below if you are watching on YouTube. And if you're watching on your favorite podcasting platform, do feel free to drop us a follow and a 5-star rating and or review. If you like what you hear, you can also find and follow me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis. You can also find our show as well at Locked On Stars. But thank you guys again for tuning in today. We will see you back here tomorrow.